Welcome to my channel on the best of fantasy. Today I am reviewing the Immortals of Meluha by Amish. This is book 1 of the Shiva Trilogy. Now, most of you, I suspect, know who Daniel Greene is, and for the maybe 3 or so of my viewers who don't know, hi Dad. Daniel Greene is one of the larger booktubers out there who focuses on fantasy. It's really a wonderful channel that he's got. He does some very insightful reviews of fantasy, and I personally enjoy watching his videos a lot. And I mention him because about a week ago, he actually reviewed the Immortals of Meluha. And while it was a very respectful review, it was largely negative. And I want to explain why, even though I actually agree with most of what Daniel Greene had to say about the book, unlike him, I intend to keep reading this trilogy. And hopefully I'll say some interesting things along the way. So I'd like to begin by just briefly summarizing Daniel Greene's review. And of course I will put a link in the description below. Now, he actually had some very nice things to say. There was some praise for the book, the plot, and the story he had some good things to say about. And he also enjoyed, I believe, the personification and the exploration of godly figures, which inspired him to do a little research and find out more about the religion and the background to the story. Also, he had some qualified praise for the book's discussion of morality. But ultimately, I think he characterized the book as a failure to launch. So among his criticisms are the flat and undeveloped characters and the poorly written prose with language that is too simplistic, and that interfered with his immersion in the story. Also, there was a lot of repetition in the story, a lot of hand-holding, which doesn't show a whole lot of faith in the reader. And I would have to agree that there's actually a lot of telling rather than showing in the book. And also there's just a lot of exposition that could be trimmed out or made into something more immediate for the reader. And I would add, actually, that the prose for me is actually too modern at times, which kicked me out of the story quite a few times. You have to keep in mind that this is a story that takes place like 4,000 years ago, and we're talking about figures here who would become gods, and there are heroes and legends and all of that. So I think that the prose could have been more elevated and more distant instead of being so contemporary at times. And it's a bit like what Ursula Le Guin talks about in her really wonderful essay, From Elfland to Poughkeepsie. Highly recommend that if you're interested in fantasy prose and how to write a good fantasy. She certainly knew her business. But the task of the fantasy writer is to awaken a kind of heightened reality with their prose, which is a kind of a distancing from the ordinary. And if your language is too contemporary, too ordinary, it fails to create that world for the reader. And so that was definitely an issue that I personally had as well, just to add to Daniel Greene's criticisms. He actually says that readers who are not bothered by the weak prose could actually enjoy the story, and I 100% agree with that assessment. And I really like that he puts emphasis on the quality of the prose. That's something I feel that more of us booktubers should do, actually, because the craft of writing is something that is certainly hard work, but very much worth pursuing. Now, there are plenty of amazing writers from India and in South Asia in general, and it has really many distinguished, brilliant writers from India and South Asia who write in English. Amish is not one of them, but I am continuing with this series. And here's why. The Immortals of Meluha taps into something significant. Otherwise, why would it be so popular? It has happened many times that a book gains great popularity without having the best prose. For me, Harry Potter pops to mind. That is a series with prose that is certainly not terrible, don't get me wrong, but it's serviceable prose. I think it's not brilliant by any means, but the series is obviously wildly successful, no matter how you feel about the prose. You can't argue about that. And that is because Harry Potter tapped into something that obviously resonated with lots of people. And I would say that the Immortals of Meluha does that as well. Another example of a series that is immensely popular and deservedly so is Wheel of Time, one very familiar to Daniel Greene, of course. And that is a series that I personally admire. I consider one of the greatest achievements in fantasy and in literature in general. It's absolutely just an amazing achievement. 14 long volumes and just an incredible story with some beautiful character arcs. But the prose, to me at least, is, while it's of course light years ahead of what you see in the Immortals of Meluha, it's not the best thing about the Wheel of Time. The prose is not. I mean, he can be, Robert Jordan's prose is actually very poetic and beautiful at times, but it can also be actually rather repetitious. And that sort of repetition, as Daniel Greene pointed out, is probably a sign of some hand-holding that ought to have been edited out. So you can have an amazing book without having the best of prose. It's something I actually hate to admit because I'm very invested personally in great writing. So even without great writing, the Shiva Trilogy has clearly tapped into something that resonates with people. All you have to do is, my goodness, look at the endorsements inside the book. You have other authors. You have the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, has endorsed the book. I mean, that's just wow. And also, I think this is very telling, actually. You have an endorsement from Amitabh Bachchan, one of the most famous actors in the world. And you also have Shekhar Kapoor, an award-winning film director. So you've got some Bollywood people who have endorsed this book. And I want to come back to that Bollywood connection here in a bit, because I think it's actually fairly important and probably telling as to why this book has done so well in South Asia. All you have to do is watch a few South Asian booktube channels to see the great enthusiasm that this trilogy has generated. And there are some criticisms as well among many of those channels, although I've found that they're not exactly consistent. So I'm going to try to put my finger on what Amish has tapped into with this story of the conflict between the Chandra Vanshis and the Surya Vanshis. And of course, into this conflict steps the legendary figure of Shiva. Now, full disclosure here, I actually have lived in South Asia and traveled all over Nepal and India, and I'm actually married to a South Asian. And so that does not make me an expert on South Asian culture by any stretch of the imagination, but I do have a love for the cultures and the traditions of South Asia. And I've read books like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, and I have attended pujas and listened at bhajans, and yes, I have even cried while watching Hindi films. So there are a couple things that I have observed that I think might be relevant here. The first thing is actually fairly evident to anyone who visits South Asia, and that is the vast importance of tradition and religion. Shiva is part of a living, breathing religion that pervades modern life. And devotion to the gods and what they represent is a deeply emotional part of life for many Hindus. It gives color to their lives and meaning, and I believe that Amish has actually successfully tapped into this. The other major point I want to talk about here is romance, and I mean it in both the narrow sense of two people getting together, but also in the bigger, broader sense of a certain kind of aesthetic. And I just want to compare the way, briefly here, superficially, the way that Bollywood treats romance to the way that Hollywood does. And I think this is kind of telling. I have a point here. So in Hollywood, there might be a little bit of eye gazing and that sort of thing, and then in the next scene, there's some sex. And it's a bit of a simplification, but in Bollywood, romance is a long, complicated dance. Actually, there are lots of dances usually, and it involves sacrifice on some level, and it tests the character's loyalties. It's an ordeal that tempers the lovers in a furnace before they can finally unite, giving the audience a deep sense of catharsis and satisfaction from what is ultimately arrived at the end of the journey. Also, unlike the macho Hollywood hero, the Bollywood hero, who's also tough, has to be a bit of a jokester. He has to make people laugh, and he has to be able to dance. And so he is a more versatile kind of character in a way. And Amish's Shiva is really cut from this mold, which is why he makes the hero joke a lot in the story. Although a lot of the jokes, I have to say, are on the level of kind of dad humor. It's not just the romance, but also the many other relationships in a typical Bollywood movie. There's a great pleasure in watching characters who are antagonistic toward each other become respectful and eventually maybe even become friends. And you see this as well in the Immortals of Meluha. The characters might be flat, but they have arcs that are emotionally satisfying, especially if you're tapped into these tropes. And so a South Asian audience is going to get that, I think, right away, and maybe somebody familiar with the culture, perhaps. So, behind Amish's weak prose is something actually very clever and beautifully done. Readers want to know what happens to the characters and are invested in them, even though they're flat, because Amish has successfully presented some important archetypes, or tropes if you'd rather call them that. Finally, Amish has taken those archetypes and put them into the service of something that is, in my opinion, a very positive thing. He has appropriated tradition and religion to challenge patriarchy and oppressive social institutions, like the caste system. Shiva sees the injustice in the situation of the Vikarma, and these are kind of an equivalent to untouchables. And there's some really deep compassion exhibited for them. And Shiva learns the value of respecting and recognizing the independence of his love interest, Sati, who is actually a strong, if not quite three-dimensional character. The story challenges the reader's faith in their own goodness while seeing only the evilness in the other. And there is some philosophy and some morality injected into the story. Not always smoothly, but these things do lend the story some depth. In closing, I'd just like to say that the greatest works of literature transcend their culture. The Immortals of Meluha does not transcend its culture, but it does embody it admirably. And since it is a culture that I personally love and am interested in, I am going to continue with this trilogy, and I anticipate that I'll enjoy it immensely. Thank you for listening, and if you're interested in fantasy, I encourage you to like and subscribe, and I hope you'll join me again as I discuss some more great fantasy. My next review is going to be Joe Abercrombie's The Trouble with Peace. I am in the midst of that already and loving it immensely. If you've seen my reviews of Joe Abercrombie's work before, you know that I'm a huge fan. So I hope you join me for that review. Until next time.